The letter had promised a new beginning, but as Eleanor Hayes stepped off the stagecoach into the dust of Silver Creek, Colorado, she could already feel the weight of 1,000 stares. Clutching her single valise, she searched the faces of the waiting crowd, looking for the man whose words had carried her 2,000 miles from Boston. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The man who had painted pictures of mountain sunrises and silver veins running through rock like God's own signature. The man whose ring she wore, though she'd never felt his touch. But Thomas Blackwood wasn't among the sea of weathered faces. And in that moment, as the mountain wind caught her skirts, Eleanor felt the first flicker of doubt that would soon erupt into a flame. The year was 1876, and America was celebrating its centennial with grand exhibitions back east, steam engines shrieking triumphantly across the continent, and the promise of fortune calling to anyone brave enough to stake a claim. For most women, in Eleanor's position, 28 years old, unmarried, with parents long buried, options were few and freedom was foreign. But Eleanor had never been like most women. When she'd seen Thomas Blackwood's advertisement in the Matrimonial Times seeking a woman of practical mind and sturdy constitution to share his life in the Colorado mining country, she'd felt something stir within her that she hadn't felt in years: hope. His letters had been honest. He didn't promise riches or luxury, but he offered partnership, respect, and a chance to build something lasting. The mountains are unforgiving, he'd written in ink that bled at the edges, but they reward those who meet them with open eyes and steady hands. Eleanor knew what it meant to face life with open eyes. She'd nursed her mother through consumption and her father through his slow surrender to grief. She'd kept ledgers for a textile mill and watched young girls waste away beneath the looms. She'd lived a life of quiet desperation in the shadows of Boston's brick-and-mortar canyons. When Thomas wrote, "I've discovered a silver vein that sings in the darkness," she heard her own heart answering. Eleanor adjusted her bonnet and straightened her travel-stained dress as she scanned the crowd once more. The high mountain sun beat down with an intensity she'd never experienced, making her skin prickle beneath her layers of proper Eastern attire. Silver Creek was smaller than she'd imagined, a collection of wooden structures huddled beneath the imposing shoulders of mountains that seemed to scrape the very sky. The air tasted different here, thin and sharp, with the scent of pine and something metallic she couldn't name. "Miss Hayes?" A voice cut through her thoughts, rough as unpolished stone. She turned to see a man approaching, his step slow and deliberate. He wasn't Thomas. She knew that immediately. Thomas had described himself as tall and fair-haired, with a scar running along his jawline from a childhood accident. This man was dark, his features shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, his clothes bearing the evidence of hard labor and harder weather. "I'm Eleanor Hayes," she confirmed, lifting her chin slightly. "I'm here to meet Thomas Blackwood." The man removed his hat, revealing eyes the color of the slate that roofed Boston churches. There was something in those eyes that made Eleanor's stomach tighten, a knowledge that wanted no sharing. "I'm Henry Wilson. I run the general store with my wife, Martha." He twisted the hat brim in his weathered hands. "Miss Hayes, I'm afraid I have difficult news." Around them, the crowd that had gathered to witness the stagecoach's arrival began to disperse, though not without backward glances. Eleanor felt herself go very still, the way she had when the doctor had finally shaken his head over her mother's bed. "Thomas Blackwood is dead," Henry said, his voice dropping low enough that only she could hear. "There was a collapse at his mine 3 weeks ago. We sent word, but it must have crossed your path on the journey." The world seemed to tilt beneath Eleanor's feet. 3 weeks ago, she had been carefully packing her few belongings, selling what couldn't be carried, saying goodbye to a life she'd been eager to leave behind. 3 weeks ago, Thomas had already been dead, and she'd been smiling at his last letter tucked close to her heart. "I see," she said, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "Martha and I have a room ready for you at our place behind the store. You can stay until—" Henry hesitated. "Until you decide what to do next. The stage heads back east in 4 days." 4 days. As if grief and reshaping one's entire future could be neatly packaged into half a week. Eleanor looked past Henry, toward the mountains that had featured so prominently in Thomas's letters. Somewhere up there was the claim he'd staked, the silver vein that sang in the darkness, the future they'd planned to build together. Now it was just another broken promise in a life that had seen too many. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I would appreciate that room tonight." Her voice was steadier than she felt. "And tomorrow, I'd like to visit Thomas's mine." Henry's expression shifted. Surprise followed quickly by concern. "Miss Hayes, that's not... The mine isn't safe, and it's a hard journey, especially for a woman." Eleanor finished for him. "Mr. Wilson, I've traveled across a continent to marry a man I'll now never meet. I think I can manage a few more miles to pay my respects." That evening, in the small back room of the Wilson store, Eleanor sat at a rough-hewn table, a cup of cooling tea before her, and Thomas's letters spread like fallen leaves. Martha Wilson, a stout woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, had shown her to the room, helped her wash away the dust of travel, and provided a simple meal before tactfully withdrawing. Now, in the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, Eleanor read Thomas's words again, searching for the man between the lines. "The vein runs deep," he'd written in his last letter. "I've named the claim Providence, because I believe some things are meant to be, like finding silver in stone, or finding you among all the women who might have answered my advertisement." A tear splashed onto the paper, blurring the ink. Eleanor quickly moved the letter aside. She hadn't cried when Henry delivered the news, hadn't cried as Martha clucked sympathetically and showed her the simple grave marker in the small cemetery behind St. Joseph's Chapel. She'd stood there, looking at the name carved in wood, and felt only a curious emptiness, as if she were reading about a stranger. But here, alone with his written voice, the loss hit her with unexpected force. Not just the loss of Thomas, but the loss of possibility, of the future she dared to imagine. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Martha stood in the doorway, a bundle in her arms. "I thought you might need these," she said, placing the stack of clothing on the bed. "They're not fancy, but they're practical for where you're heading." Eleanor fingered the coarse fabric, trousers, a flannel shirt, and a sturdy jacket. "I wasn't aware I'd decided where I'm heading." Martha's smile was knowing. "You have the look. I recognize it. It's the same look my Henry had when we left. Pennsylvania, like you're already gone from one place, but not quite arrived at the next." She sat on the edge of the bed. "Thomas spoke of you, you know, in the weeks before the accident. Said he'd finally found someone who understood that living means more than just surviving." Eleanor's throat tightened. "You knew him well?" "Well enough. He wasn't like most of the men who come through here, chasing rumors of silver and gold. He had patience, said mining was like having a conversation with the mountain. You had to listen as much as dig." Martha sighed. "He was careful too. That's why the collapse was such a shock. Henry thinks—" She stopped abruptly, glancing toward the door as if concerned about being overheard. "What does Henry think?" Eleanor pressed. Martha's voice dropped to a whisper. "There's been talk. Strange things happening at claims that show promise. Men getting spooked, selling cheap. Thomas wouldn't sell, said his providence was meant for you both." A chill that had nothing to do with the mountain night crept up Eleanor's spine. Are you saying someone might have caused the collapse? I'm saying be careful who you trust in Silver Creek. Martha stood, smoothing her apron. Now, if you're still set on seeing that mine tomorrow, you'll need a guide. There's a man named Jackson Walker. He knows the mountains better than most, and he owed Thomas a favor. I'll send word to him tonight. After Martha left, Eleanor returned to the letters, but her mind kept circling back to the woman's unfinished warning. She'd come to Colorado prepared for the physical dangers of frontier life, disease, harsh weather, the isolation of mountain living. She hadn't considered that the greatest threat might come from human greed. If Thomas had indeed been murdered, for his claim, what chance did she, an Eastern woman alone, have of discovering the truth? She carefully folded the letters and tucked them into her reticule. Then she picked up the trousers Martha had left and held them against her waist. They would need taking in, but they would serve. Tomorrow she would see this providence that Thomas had believed in so firmly. She would stand where he had stood, touch the silver vein he had touched, and then she would decide what to do with the shattered pieces of their shared dream. Dawn brought a sky streaked with gold and crimson, the mountains black silhouettes against the awakening day. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Eleanor had slept little, her mind too full of questions and half-formed plans. She'd risen before first light to alter Martha's borrowed clothes, taking in the waist of the trousers and rolling up the cuffs. Now, dressed in attire that would have scandalized Boston society, she braided her hair tightly and tucked it beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Martha raised an eyebrow when Eleanor emerged, but nodded approvingly. "Practical," she said. "Jackson's waiting out front. He's brought a horse for you." Eleanor's stomach knotted. She'd never ridden astride before, had only occasionally taken genteel rides in the park with a side saddle. But she merely nodded and followed Martha through the store, where Henry was already arranging goods for the day's business. He glanced up as they passed. "Miss Hayes, I wish you'd reconsider. The mine is several hours' ride, and the trail isn't easy. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Wilson, but my mind is made up." Outside, the early morning air bit at Eleanor's cheeks. Town was beginning to stir, smoke rising from chimneys, a few figures moving purposefully between buildings. Standing beside two horses was a man whose appearance made Eleanor pause. Jackson Walker was tall and lean, with skin burnished by sun and wind. His features suggested mixed heritage, the high cheekbones and straight nose of native ancestry, combined with eyes that reminded Eleanor of the green glass bottles her mother had collected. He wore buckskin leggings and a faded blue shirt, with a revolver holstered at his hip and a knife sheathed at his belt. His face was impassive as he assessed her, but Eleanor caught a flicker of surprise at her attire. "Miss Hayes," he greeted her, his voice unexpectedly gentle. "Martha says you want to see Blackwood's claim." "I do, Mr. Walker." He nodded once. "It's a hard ride. Sure you're up to it?" "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, an edge of defensiveness she couldn't quite suppress. To her surprise, Jackson's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Fair enough." He gestured to the smaller of the two horses, a sturdy mountain pony with intelligent eyes. "This is Penny. She knows the trail and will follow my horse. Without much guidance, can you mount?" Eleanor approached the horse, grateful that it wasn't as tall as those she'd seen pulling carriages in Boston. Still, she hesitated, unsure of the mechanics of mounting astride. Before she could embarrass herself, Jackson stepped forward. "If I may," he said, and when she nodded, he made a stirrup of his hands. She placed her boot in his palms, and with one fluid motion, he boosted her into the saddle. The sensation was strange, both more secure and more vulnerable than a side saddle. Eleanor gripped the pommel, adjusting to the feeling of the horse between her legs, the breadth of the saddle beneath her. "Keep your weight centered," Jackson advised, swinging easily onto his own mount. "Let your body move with hers, not against her." They set out slowly, giving Eleanor time to find her balance. Silver Creek fell behind them as they followed a narrow trail that wound steadily upward. The morning sun strengthened, burning away the last wisps of dawn mist, revealing a landscape of such raw beauty that Eleanor found herself breathless, though whether from the altitude or the vista, she couldn't say. Pine forests gave way to meadows starred with wildflowers, then back to forest again, the trees growing more gnarled and determined as they climbed. Jackson rode slightly ahead, occasionally pointing out landmarks or warning of difficult stretches. He spoke little otherwise, for which Eleanor was grateful. It took all her concentration to stay seated and absorb the unfamiliar surroundings. By midday, Eleanor's muscles were screaming in protest. They had stopped twice to rest the horses and drink from mountain streams so cold the water made her teeth ache. Now they paused in a small clearing, and Jackson dismounted, coming around, to help Eleanor from her saddle. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground. She stumbled, and Jackson caught her elbow, steadying her with surprising gentleness. "First time riding?" he asked, no judgment in his tone. "Is it that obvious?" She managed a wry smile, gingerly stretching her aching limbs. "You've done well for a first ride, especially on this trail." He led the horses to a patch of grass and loosened their girths before retrieving a small pack from his saddle. Martha sent food. They ate, in silence, strips of dried venison, cornbread, and early apples. Eleanor's hunger surprised her. She hadn't had much appetite since receiving the news of Thomas's death. But the physical exertion and mountain air had awakened something in her, a recognition that whatever else had changed, her body still demanded sustenance. "You knew Thomas?" she asked finally, when the edge of her hunger had been blunted. Jackson nodded, his gaze on the distant peaks. "We had an arrangement. I helped him identify promising locations. He taught me about mining techniques." A pause. "He was a good man, didn't look at me and see just half-breed." Eleanor studied him, noting the careful neutrality of his expression. "You don't believe the collapse was an accident?" It wasn't a question, and Jackson didn't treat it as one. His green eyes met hers, assessing. Thomas was careful, knew what he was doing, and his claim was showing promise. Martha mentioned there's been trouble at promising claims. Silas Mercer and his boys. Jackson's jaw tightened. They work, and for Victor Holloway, though you won't find proof of that. Holloway owns the largest mine in the area, wants to own them all, offers to buy claims. If the owner refuses, he shrugged, the gesture eloquent in its simplicity, and the law does nothing? A flicker of something, bitterness perhaps, crossed Jackson's face. "No marshal in Silver Creek. Nearest law is 2 days' ride, and they don't much care what happens to miners, especially not when Holloway spreads his money around." Eleanor absorbed this, anger kindling in her chest. So Thomas was murdered for his claim, and no one will be held accountable. "I didn't say that." Jackson rewrapped the remaining food, said there's no law, didn't say there's no justice. There was a quality to his voice that made Eleanor study him more closely. "You were friends with Thomas." "As much as anyone. He spoke of you often. 'My Ellie,' he called you, said you had a mind as sharp as a new pick and a heart as true as bedrock." The simple words struck Eleanor like a physical blow. My Ellie. No one had called her that since her father died. She turned away, blinking rapidly to clear the sudden moisture from her eyes. "We should keep moving," Jackson said quietly, giving her the moment of privacy. "Still have a ways to go." The afternoon brought steeper trails and narrower passages. Twice they had to dismount, and lead the horses around particularly treacherous sections. Eleanor's muscles protested, but she set her jaw and pressed on, determined not to show weakness. Each step took her closer to Thomas, or at least to the place that had claimed his life and might hold answers to his death. It was late afternoon when Jackson reined in his horse and pointed to a narrow cut in the mountainside ahead. "Providence," he said simply. Eleanor felt her heart quicken. The entrance to the mine was smaller than she'd imagined, a dark wound. In the grey-green face of the mountain, beside it stood a small cabin, its walls constructed of rough-hewn logs, its roof patched in places. A stream gurgled nearby, and the remnants of an ore-sorting area was visible, a table, some tools, buckets, and the beginnings of a sluice. "Thomas built that cabin for you," Jackson said quietly. "Finished it the week before the collapse." Eleanor swallowed hard. The simple structure seemed to embody all the hopes and plans that Thomas had entrusted to paper, all the dreams they had shared across the miles. She dismounted without waiting for Jackson's assistance, her legs steadier. Now, despite the day's journey, the cabin door was secured with a simple latch. Inside, she found a single room with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed built into one wall, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves holding basic supplies. Someone, Martha perhaps, had cleaned recently. There was no dust on the surfaces, and the bedding looked fresh, but there were still signs of Thomas everywhere. A well-worn book of poetry on the table, a shirt hanging from a peg, a half-whittled piece of wood beside a knife. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a chunk of quartz, threaded with gleaming silver, positioned like a prized possession. Beside it was a small box. Eleanor opened it with trembling fingers to find a silver pendant, crudely but lovingly fashioned, in the shape of a heart. "He made that from the first silver he pulled from Providence," Jackson said from the doorway. "Called it his lucky strike, said he was going to give it to you when you arrived." Eleanor closed her fingers around the pendant, feeling the edges dig into her palm. Something hot and fierce rose in her chest, a surge of emotion too complex to name. Grief for the man she'd never meet, rage at those who had taken him, and beneath it all, a determination that surprised her with its intensity. "Show me the mine," she said, slipping the pendant over her head. Jackson's expression was unreadable. "It's not safe. The entrance is unstable." "I didn't come all this way to turn back now." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I need to see it, Mr. Walker. I need to understand." For a long moment, he studied her, as if measuring her resolve against the danger. Then he nodded once. "Stay behind me," he said. "Step exactly where I step. And if I say run, you run." The mine entrance was partially blocked by fallen timber and rock. Jackson lit a lantern and led the way, moving with a care that spoke volumes about the danger. Eleanor followed close behind, her senses overwhelmed by the sudden darkness, the smell of damp earth and something metallic, the way sound seemed to both deaden and echo in the narrow passage. They couldn't go far. About 20 feet in, the tunnel was completely collapsed, a jumble of broken supports and fallen stone blocking any further progress. Jackson held the lantern high, illuminating the destruction. "This wasn't natural," he said, his voice low. "See those support beams? They were cut partway through. Wouldn't give way immediately, but eventually." He trailed off, the implication clear. Eleanor stared at the tomb of rock and timber where Thomas had drawn his last breath. She thought of him working here, believing in the future they would build, unaware of the sabotage that would claim his life. She thought of the men responsible walking free in Silver Creek while Thomas lay in consecrated ground behind St. Joseph's Chapel. "The claim," she said finally, her voice tight. "What happens to it now? By rights, it should be yours, as Thomas's intended, but without proof of marriage." Jackson shrugged. Holloway's probably already filed a claim jumpers petition. In 4 days, when the judge passes through, he'll get legal ownership. 4 days. The same amount of time until the eastbound stage left Silver Creek. As if the universe were presenting her with a clear choice: return to the life she'd so eagerly left behind, or stay and fight for a dead man's dream. "I'm staying," Eleanor said, the words surprising her even as they left her mouth. "I'm staying, and I'm claiming what's mine." Jackson's expression shifted, surprise followed by something that might have been respect. "Miss Hayes," "Eleanor," she corrected him. "Or Ellie, if you prefer. If we're going to work together, Mr. Walker, we should use our given names." "Jackson," he offered in return, "but you need to understand what you're saying. Holloway won't just walk away, and Mercer and his boys, they don't hesitate to use violence." Eleanor touched the silver pendant at her throat, thinking of Thomas dying alone in the darkness. "Neither do I," she said, with a conviction that came from some deep, previously untapped part of her being. Not anymore. As they emerged from the mine into the fading afternoon light, Eleanor took one last look at the small cabin, the stream, the forest beyond. This wild, beautiful, dangerous place that Thomas had chosen, that he had prepared for their life together. She hadn't come to Colorado looking for a fight, but she hadn't come to surrender either. "We'll need supplies," she said, her mind already racing ahead, "and I'll need to learn everything Thomas knew about mining, about this claim, about Silver Creek and its people." She turned to Jackson, who was watching her with an inscrutable expression. "Will you help me?" For a long moment he was silent. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Thomas believed in you, said you had grit beneath those proper Eastern manners." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Guess we'll find out how right he was." As they mounted their horses for the journey back to town, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Eleanor felt a strange calm settling over her, a clarity of purpose that cut through the fog of grief and uncertainty. Thomas was gone, but Providence remained. And Providence, it seemed, had brought her here for a reason. The trail back would be even more treacherous in the gathering dusk, but Eleanor found she wasn't afraid. The dangers ahead, both those of the mountain pass and those waiting in Silver Creek, seemed less terrifying now that she had made her choice. She would stay, she would fight, she would claim what was rightfully hers. And if Silas Mercer and Victor Holloway thought a Boston lady would be easily intimidated, they were about to learn otherwise. The return journey to Silver Creek was made in near darkness, with only the pale glow of the rising moon to illuminate the treacherous mountain path. Eleanor's muscles protested with each movement, unused to the demands of horseback riding. But she kept her discomfort to herself. Jackson rode slightly ahead, occasionally glancing back to ensure she was managing the difficult terrain. They spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hooves on stone and the whisper of wind through the pines. By the time the scattered lights of Silver Creek appeared below them, Eleanor was swaying with exhaustion, her hands numb from gripping the reins. "You did well," Jackson said quietly as they approached the edge of town. "Most newcomers can't handle that trail even in daylight." Eleanor straightened her spine, determined not to collapse now that safety was in sight. "Necessity is a powerful teacher, Mr. Walker Jackson," she corrected herself, the informal address still unfamiliar on her tongue. His lips quirked in what might have been a smile. "That it is." He nodded toward the building ahead, where a lamp burned in the window of the Wilson store. "Get some rest tonight. Tomorrow things get complicated." Martha was waiting when Eleanor staggered through the door, her sharp eyes taking in the fatigue etched on the younger woman's face. Without a word, she steered Eleanor to a chair and placed a steaming mug of tea in her hands. "Drink," she ordered. "Then soak in the bath I've prepared. Those muscles will seize up something fierce. Otherwise..." Eleanor sipped the tea gratefully, tasting honey and something herbal and unfamiliar. "Thank you for everything." Martha waved away the gratitude. "Did you find what you were looking for up there?" For a moment, Eleanor was silent, the weight of the silver pendant heavy against her collarbone. Had she found what she was looking for? Thomas was gone, his dream of their shared future buried beneath tons of rock. But something else had taken root in its place, a determination she hadn't known she possessed. "I found more than I expected," she said finally. "I'm staying, Martha. I'm going to fight for Thomas's claim." The older woman's expression softened. "I thought you might. That's why I had Henry prepare these." She reached beneath the counter and withdrew a stack of papers. "Claim registration, proof of Thomas's ownership, and a petition for transfer of property to a surviving spouse." Eleanor's eyebrows rose. "But we weren't married." "No," Martha agreed, a glint of something that might have been mischief in her eyes. "But who's to say otherwise? The minister who was supposed to marry you has moved on to Denver. The town records burned in a fire last spring. And Henry and I are prepared to sign an affidavit stating that Thomas Blackwood introduced you as his wife when you arrived on the stage 3 months ago." Eleanor stared at the woman, momentarily speechless. "You would commit perjury for me. Why? You barely know me." Martha's face hardened. "Because I've watched Victor Holloway swallow up this town claim by claim for 5 years. Because Thomas Blackwood was one of the few men who stood against him. And because if you're half the woman Thomas described in his letters, you deserve a fighting chance." She pushed the papers across the table. "The circuit judge arrives in 4 days. Henry will help you file these tomorrow." That night, soaking in the steaming bath Martha had prepared, Eleanor turned the pendant over in her fingers, watching the lamplight play across the crude silver heart. The journey to the mine had forced her to confront the physical reality of Thomas's death in a way that the simple wooden grave marker had not. The collapsed tunnel, the half-whittled wood beside his knife, the book of poetry open to a page marked with a pressed flower. These were the remnants of a life cut short, of plans never realized. Yet in the midst of that loss, she'd found something unexpected, a sense of purpose that burned brighter and more insistent than grief. If Thomas had truly been murdered for his claim, then perhaps the best way to honor him was to fight for it, not to preserve some sentimental connection to a man she'd never met, but because it was right, because it was just. Because in her 28 years, Eleanor Hayes had grown weary of yielding to the forces that had shaped her life without her consent. Morning brought renewed determination and unexpected allies. Henry Wilson proved to be as resourceful as his wife, accompanying Eleanor to the assayer's office with the forged marriage documents in hand. The assayer, a nervous man named Pritchard with ink-stained fingers, glanced from the papers to Eleanor's resolute face. Mrs. Blackwood, you understand that once filed, these documents constitute a legal claim of ownership? False statements would be perjury." "I understand the law, Mr. Pritchard," Eleanor replied evenly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "My husband's claim is rightfully mine. I intend to work it as he would have wanted." Pritchard's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. "There's been interest in the Providence claim from Mr. Holloway." Henry's hand came to rest on the counter, fingers spread wide. "Is there a problem with Mrs. Blackwood's paperwork, Pritchard?" The assayer's eyes darted between them before he sighed and reached for his stamp. No problem." The official seal pressed into the paper with a dull thud that seemed to echo in the small office. "The claim is recorded in your name, Mrs. Blackwood. May it bring you better fortune than it brought your husband." Outside, Eleanor released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you, Henry. I wouldn't have known how to navigate that without you." The storekeeper shook his head. "Don't thank me yet. This is just the beginning." Word will reach Holloway before sundown, and he won't take it kindly. He glanced down the muddy main street. Speaking of which, a man was approaching, his immaculate appearance incongruous with the rustic surroundings. Victor Holloway cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with a silver-streaked beard and the confident stride of someone accustomed to deference. His suit was Eastern cut, his boots polished to a mirror shine despite the dusty street. "Mrs. Blackwood," he called, his voice carrying easily in the morning air. "A moment of your time, if you please." Eleanor straightened her spine, grateful for the borrowed clothes that allowed her to stand her ground without the encumbrance of petticoats and corsets. "Mr. Holloway, I presume." He came to a stop before her, removing his hat with practiced courtesy. Up close, his eyes were the cold blue of a winter sky, assessing her with clinical interest. "My condolences on your loss. Thomas Blackwood was a fine prospector. His death was a tragedy." "Thank you," Eleanor replied, her tone neutral. "Though I understand you were attempting to purchase his claim not long before the accident." Something flickered across Holloway's face, surprise perhaps at her directness. "Business and personal sentiment often exist in parallel, Mrs. Blackwood. I made Thomas a fair offer for a claim showing modest promise. He declined, as was his right. His smile didn't reach his eyes. I'd like to extend the same offer to you. $500 for the Providence claim. A generous sum that would see you comfortably back to Boston or wherever you might wish to go." Henry made a small noise beside her, but Eleanor kept her gaze steady on Holloway. "How interesting that you assume I wish to leave, Mr. Holloway. I've only just arrived, and I find Silver Creek quite stimulating." Holloway's smile tightened. "A mining camp is no place for a woman alone, Mrs. Blackwood, especially one unaccustomed to our ways. $500 would spare you considerable hardship." "Your concern for my welfare is touching," Eleanor replied, her voice cool, but unnecessary. "The Providence claim is not for sale. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have business to attend to." She moved to step past him, but Holloway shifted slightly, blocking her path. $750, he said, his voice lower. "My final offer. Consider carefully, Mrs. Blackwood. The mountains can be dangerous. Accidents happen with alarming frequency to the unprepared." The threat, though veiled, hung in the air between them. Eleanor met his gaze unflinchingly. "Yes, they do seem to happen frequently to those who refuse your offers. How unfortunate." She stepped around him deliberately. "Good day, Mr. Holloway. I believe our business is concluded." As they walked away, Henry released a low whistle. "You've got nerve, I'll give you that. But Holloway doesn't take rejection well." "So I gathered," Eleanor murmured, her heart racing despite her outward composure. "How long do you think before he sends Mercer to deliver a more forceful message?" "Not long." Henry's expression was grim. "You should talk to Jackson. Learn to use a firearm, at the very least." Eleanor nodded, thinking of the revolver she'd seen holstered at Jackson's hip. "Where can I find him?" "At this hour, probably the livery. He does farrier work when he's not guiding or hunting." The livery stable stood at the edge of town, the rhythmic ping of metal on metal guiding Eleanor to where Jackson crouched beside a massive draft horse, examining its hoof. Sweat gleamed on his forearms as he worked, his movements precise and careful despite the animal's size. He glanced up as she approached, surprise flickering across his features. "You're walking like you spent yesterday in a saddle," he observed, returning his attention to the horse's hoof. "Is that your way of saying I look terrible?" Eleanor asked dryly. A faint smile touched his lips. "Just an observation. What brings you here?" Eleanor watched as he positioned a horseshoe and drove in the first nail with practiced efficiency. "I've filed claim to Providence," she said without preamble. "Holloway already approached me with an offer." $750. Jackson's hands stilled momentarily before resuming their work. That's more than he offered Thomas. I declined. He made it clear there could be consequences. With a final tap, Jackson released the horse's hoof and straightened, wiping his ends on a rag. There will be. Mercer and his boys don't waste time. He studied her face, his expression unreadable. You're not having second thoughts. It wasn't a question, but Eleanor answered anyway. No, but I'm not a fool either. I need to learn to defend myself. And I need to understand mining, how to work the claim, what Thomas found, how to prove its value. Jackson was silent for a long moment, his green eyes searching her face as if looking for something specific. Whatever it was, he seemed to find it, because he nodded once decisively. The defending part I can help with, he said. As for the mining, I know enough to get started, but Thomas kept detailed notes in a journal, probably at the cabin. Then we need to return to Providence, Eleanor said, as soon as possible. Jackson's eyebrows rose slightly. Your muscles disagreeing with that plan yet? Despite herself, Eleanor smiled, vehemently, but they'll have to adjust. I have 4 days until the judge arrives. I need to be prepared. 3 things first, Jackson said, all trace of humor vanishing from his expression. 1, you need a weapon and the skill to use it. 2, we need supplies, enough to last at the cabin for several days. And 3, he hesitated. You need to understand what you're walking into. Holloway doesn't make idle threats, and Mercer enjoys his work. Eleanor thought of the collapsed tunnel, of Thomas dying alone in the darkness. I understand exactly what I'm walking into, she said quietly. The question is, do they? That afternoon, in a secluded clearing beyond the edge of town, Jackson placed a revolver in Eleanor's hands. It was heavier than she'd expected, the metal cool against her palm. Colt Navy, he explained. 6 shots. Reliable if you maintain it properly. He guided her fingers through the mechanisms. How to load, how to cock the hammer, how to aim. Don't point it at anything you're not prepared to shoot, he warned. And remember, your first shot is your most important. Most fights end after that. Eleanor listened intently, absorbing the instruction with the same methodical focus she'd once applied to learning bookkeeping. Her first attempts at hitting the row of bottles Jackson had arranged were dismal, the recoil surprising her despite his warnings. But by the 3rd reload, she'd managed to shatter 2 bottles, and by the 5th, her aim had improved enough that Jackson nodded with grudging approval. You're a quick study, he remarked. Keep practicing, and you'll be adequate. High praise indeed, Eleanor said dryly, but there was no real sting in her words. She understood the stakes were too high for false encouragement. Adequate meant she might survive. Anything less meant she almost certainly wouldn't. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they packed their supplies into saddlebags, provisions for several days, tools, ammunition, and medicines from Martha's personal stores. The plan was to leave at first light, riding hard to reach Providence by midday. Eleanor spent the evening in the Wilsons' kitchen, listening as Henry outlined what to expect from the circuit judge's visit. Judge Hammond's fair, but he's busy. He'll have dozens of cases to hear in the 2 days he's here. Yours will likely be just one of many property disputes. Henry pushed a sheet of paper across the table. These are the key points you need to establish. Your marriage to Thomas, your intention to continue working the claim, and any evidence that the claim is being actively developed. Eleanor studied the notes, committing them to memory. And what about the circumstances of Thomas's death, the sabotage at the mine? Martha and Henry exchanged glances. Without proof, that's dangerous ground, Martha said gently. Accusations against a man of Holloway's standing won't be taken lightly. So justice for Thomas depends on whether I can secure his property, not whether his murderers are punished, Eleanor said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. Welcome to the frontier, Henry replied, his tone resigned. Out here, a person's value is often measured by what they own and what they can produce. It's not right, but it's reality. Eleanor thought of Boston, of the textile mill where she'd kept ledgers while young girls worked themselves to exhaustion for pennies a day. That's not unique to the frontier, she said quietly, just more honest about its cruelty. The night was restless, filled with snatches of sleep interrupted by vivid dreams. Thomas reaching for her from within the collapsed mine, Holloway's cold eyes watching her, the weight of the revolver in her hand as she faced unseen threats. She rose before dawn, washing her face in the basin of cold water Martha had left for her, then dressing in the practical clothes that no longer felt quite so foreign against her skin. Jackson was waiting when she emerged, 2 horses saddled and ready. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, the stars fading as night retreated. The air held the sharp chill of mountain mornings, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. "Ready?" he asked simply. Eleanor nodded, securing her saddlebags and checking the revolver holstered at her hip, a gift from Jackson that she had accepted without protest, understanding its necessity. She mounted with more grace than she had the previous day, her body beginning to adapt to the unfamiliar movements. They rode in companionable silence as the sun crested the mountains, painting the landscape in gold and amber. Eleanor found herself studying the terrain with new eyes, noting the passes, the sheltered valleys, the places where the trail narrowed or where the forest provided cover. Strategic points, she realized, places where they might be ambushed or where they might defend themselves if necessary. It was nearing midday when Jackson suddenly raised his hand, signaling her to stop. He cocked his head, listening intently, then gestured for her to follow him off the trail into a grove of aspens. Their leaves trembled in the slight breeze, creating a whispering backdrop to the silence. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, keeping her voice low. "Riders," Jackson murmured, "coming from the direction of Providence." Eleanor's heart quickened. "Mercer?" Before he could answer, the sound of hoofbeats became audible, growing louder as 3 horsemen rounded the bend in the trail. Even at a distance, Eleanor recognized the center figure. Silas Mercer was hard to mistake, with his hulking frame and the distinctive red beard that jutted from his chin like a flame. The 2 men flanking him were younger, with a similar cast to their features that suggested they might be brothers. "The Fleming boys," Jackson confirmed, following her gaze. "Caleb and Wyatt mean as rattlers and twice as quick to strike." Eleanor watched as the 3 men passed their hiding place, oblivious to their presence. Mercer was laughing, a sound like gravel caught in machinery. The saddlebags draped across his horse's flanks bulged with something heavy. "They've been to the cabin," she whispered, a cold certainty settling in her stomach. Jackson nodded grimly. "Let's find out what they left behind." They waited until the riders were well past before continuing their journey, moving with greater caution now. As they approached the small clearing where Providence's cabin stood, Eleanor braced herself for destruction. But the cabin appeared, untouched, at least from the outside. Door closed, windows intact, no signs of forced entry. "Stay here," Jackson ordered, drawing his revolver as he dismounted. He approached the cabin cautiously, moving in a half-crouch, his eyes scanning the surroundings. After a tense moment, he tried the door latch. It opened easily. Eleanor held her breath as he disappeared inside. Seconds stretched like hours until he emerged, his expression tight. "It's clear," he called, "but they've been through everything." The interior of the cabin was in disarray. Drawers emptied onto the floor, the mattress slashed and its stuffing scattered, shelves swept clean. Eleanor moved through the chaos methodically, assessing what had been taken and what remained. "They were looking for something specific," she said, noting that several valuable items, Thomas's silver pocket watch, a small nugget of native silver, remained untouched on the mantel. Jackson knelt beside an overturned chest, sorting through the scattered clothing and personal effects. Thomas's journal is gone, he confirmed, and his claim maps. Eleanor pressed her lips together, fighting a wave of frustration. Without those documents, proving the value of Providence would be significantly harder. Why not just destroy the cabin entirely? Or collapse the mine entrance further? Because Holloway works through the law when possible, Jackson replied. Mercer took what they need to challenge your claim legally. If that fails... He left the implication hanging. Eleanor surveyed the wreckage, a strange calm settling over her. They had been expecting this, preparing for it. This was not a fatal blow, merely the opening move in a game whose rules she was still learning. Then we have work to do, she said simply. They spent the remainder of the day restoring order to the cabin and examining the mine entrance. The latter proved more promising than expected. While the main tunnel remained blocked by the collapse, Jackson discovered a second, narrower passage that Thomas had begun to excavate. A crosscut, he explained, holding his lantern high to illuminate the rough-hewn tunnel. Thomas was following the vein. It branches here. He ran his fingers along a silvery thread embedded in the rock face. This is what they're after. High grade. Or not a massive deposit from what I can see, but rich. Eleanor studied the gleaming line, trying to see it through Thomas's eyes. Had he felt triumph when he first uncovered it, hope for the future they might build together? A fierce determination seized her, not just to secure the claim for herself, but to complete what he had started. "Show me what to do," she said, rolling up her sleeves. Jackson regarded her skeptically. "Mining isn't something you learn in an afternoon. It takes strength, skill, and experience." "Then I'll start developing all three today," Eleanor replied, her tone brooking no argument. "Thomas believed I could do this. I intend to prove him right." After a moment's hesitation, Jackson handed her a small pick. "We'll start with sampling. The judge will want proof that the claim is viable and being worked. We need specimens that show the quality of the ore." For the next several hours, Eleanor learned the rudiments of mining, how to identify promising rock, how to extract samples without causing collapse, how to sort the valuable from the worthless. The work was physically demanding, the air in the tunnel close and dust-filled, despite Jackson's efforts to shore up ventilation. By the time they emerged into the late afternoon sunlight, Eleanor's arms ached. Her hands were raw despite the gloves Jackson had insisted she wear, and her lungs burned with each breath. But clutched in her palm were several chunks of quartz threaded with silver, physical proof of Providence's promise. As the sun began to set, they established a defensive perimeter around the cabin. Jackson taught her how to set simple alarms, cords strung with tin cans, branches positioned to snap loudly if disturbed. They agreed to take watches through the night, neither willing to risk being caught unawares if Mercer and his men returned. Sitting on the cabin's small porch as dusk deepened into night, Eleanor found herself staring at the stars emerging above the mountain peaks. They seemed closer here, more numerous and brilliant than they had ever appeared in Boston's smoke-hazed skies. "Thomas wrote about the stars," she said softly. "In his letters. He said they were different here, wilder somehow, more honest." Jackson, cleaning his revolver by the light of the lantern, glanced up. "They're the same stars," he said after a moment, "just nothing here to hide them." Eleanor considered this, rolling one of the silver-laced stones between her fingers. "Is that why you stay? Because there's nothing to hide the truth?" His hands stilled momentarily before resuming their methodical work. "I stay because I don't belong anywhere else. Not fully." He reassembled the revolver with practiced efficiency. "My mother was Ute. My father was a trapper who wintered with her people for 3 seasons, then moved on. I grew up in both worlds, but never entirely part of either. It was the most he had ever shared about himself, and Eleanor recognized the significance of the offering. Thomas belonged here, she said. That much is clear from everything he built. I'm not sure I do, not yet, but I'm beginning to understand why he chose this place. Jackson nodded, holstering the cleaned weapon. The mountains don't care who you were before, only who you are now and whether you're strong enough to survive. He rose, stretching muscles no doubt as sore as her own. I'll take first watch. Try to get some sleep. Inside the small cabin, Eleanor lay on the newly remade bed, listening to the night sounds, the soft hooting of an owl, the whisper of wind through pine boughs, the occasional creak of floorboards as Jackson moved on the porch. Despite her exhaustion, sleep proved elusive. She found herself thinking of Thomas, imagining him in this same space, planning and dreaming and working toward a future that included her. She wondered what he would make of her now, a proper Boston lady turned frontier miner with calloused hands and a revolver by her bedside. Would he be proud, dismayed, or simply bemused by the transformation his death had wrought? It didn't matter, she realized. What mattered was that in choosing to fight for Providence, she had discovered something Providence of her own. A strength and determination she hadn't known she possessed, a willingness to defy convention and expectation in pursuit of what she believed was right. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Mercer and his men might return. The ore samples might prove insufficient to convince the judge. Holloway might find some legal technicality to undermine her claim. But for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach into the dust of Silver Creek, Eleanor felt something akin to certainty. Whatever came, she would face it on her own terms. The next morning dawned clear and cold, frost silvering the grass around the cabin. Eleanor woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Jackson splitting wood outside. She rose, wincing at the protests of muscles unused to yesterday's labor, and moved to the small mirror hanging beside the door. The face that looked back at her was changed, sun-reddened despite her hat, smudged with dirt she'd missed in her hasty washing the night before, eyes bright with purpose rather than shadowed with grief. She splashed water from the basin onto her face, redid her braid, and straightened her borrowed clothing. There would be time for more thorough ablutions later. For now, there was work to be done. Outside, Jackson acknowledged her with a nod as he stacked the split wood beside the cabin door. "Sleep well?" he asked, though they both knew the answer. "Well enough," she replied, pouring herself a cup of the strong black coffee from the pot nestled in the coals of the morning fire. "What's our plan for today?" Jackson gestured toward the mine entrance. "More sampling. We need enough quality specimens to make our case. Then we should head back to town. The judge arrives tomorrow and you'll want to be prepared." The morning passed in much the same way as the previous afternoon, with Eleanor learning the basics of mining under Jackson's a patient instruction. Her hands found a rhythm with the tools, her eyes growing more adept at spotting the telltale gleam of silver in the rock face. By midday, they had accumulated a respectable collection of samples, each carefully wrapped in cloth and stowed in Jackson's saddlebags. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor took a final look at the small cabin, the cleared area around it, the mine entrance with its promise of hidden wealth. In just 2 days, this place had become more than just Thomas's legacy. It had become the battleground for her own future, a symbol of her determination to forge a path distinct from the one society had prescribed for her. "We'll be back," she said softly, as much to herself as to the silent mountains. The return journey to Silver Creek was made in watchful silence, both of them alert for any sign of Mercer and his men. But the trail remained clear, and they reached town as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen. The small settlement seemed unusually busy, with wagons and riders crowding the main street. "Judge must have arrived early," Jackson observed as they dismounted in front of the Wilsons' store. That's his buggy outside the Silver Dollar. Eleanor's heart quickened. She had expected one more day to prepare, to review the documents with Henry, to gather her thoughts. Now she would have to move quickly. Martha met them at the door, her normally composed features tense with worry. "Thank heaven you're back," she said, ushering them inside. The judge arrived at noon, and Holloway's already filed a claim jumper's petition against you. The hearing is set for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Henry emerged from the back room, his expression equally grave. That's not all. Holloway's brought in witnesses who claim you were never married to Thomas. Says you're an imposter trying to steal valuable property. Witnesses, Eleanor repeated, a cold knot forming in her stomach. 3 men who worked Holloway's mine alongside Thomas last winter. They're prepared to testify that he never mentioned a wife, never showed them. Letters never indicated he was expecting you. Eleanor exchanged glances with Jackson. And our word against theirs? 3 men known in the community versus a woman who arrived days ago, Martha said bluntly. It doesn't look good. Eleanor set her jaw, refusing to allow despair to take a hold. Then we need something more than words. We have the ore samples, proof that the claim is valuable and that I'm actively working it. What else can we offer? Henry ran a hand through his thinning hair. The judge will want documentation. Marriage certificate, letters, anything that establishes your relationship with Thomas. The letters were in my valise, Eleanor said, and Mercer didn't take Thomas's pocket watch or the silver pendant. Both are inscribed with messages that suggest an intimate connection. It's a start, Henry acknowledged, but without the journal or the claim maps, proving the mine's value will be harder. Holloway will argue that you have no knowledge of mining, no ability to work the claim properly. And then we need to find someone who can testify to my capabilities, Eleanor said, her mind racing. Someone besides Jackson, whose connection to Thomas might be used to discredit him. Martha frowned thoughtfully. What about Pritchard at the assayer's office? He's processed Thomas's ore samples before. If he can verify that the new samples match Thomas's previous findings, it's worth trying, Henry agreed. I can speak with him tonight. As the others discussed strategy, Eleanor became aware of Jackson watching her, his expression unreadable. What is it? She asked quietly. There's another option, he said, his voice pitched low for her ears alone. Thomas had a lockbox at the bank. He mentioned it once. Said it contained papers. Too valuable to keep at the cabin. Eleanor's pulse quickened. The journal? Possibly, or duplicate claim maps, but accessing it would require proof you're his widow. Which is exactly what we're trying to establish, Eleanor finished, understanding the circular problem. Still, it's worth investigating. The banker might be more easily convinced than a judge. The bank was closed by the time they finished their planning, forcing them to wait until morning. Eleanor spent the evening going through her valise, organizing Thomas's letters chronologically and selecting those that most clearly established their relationship and plans for the future. The silver pendant hung at her throat, a tangible connection to the man she'd never met, but whose legacy she was fighting to preserve. That night, as she prepared for bed, a soft knock sounded at her door. Martha entered, carrying a bundle of fabric that she placed on the bed with unusual solemnity. I altered one of my dresses for you, she said, unfolding the garment to reveal a simple but well-made gown of deep blue wool. For the hearing tomorrow, first impressions matter, especially with Judge Hammond. Eleanor ran her fingers over the fabric, understanding the significance of the gesture. You think I should appear more conventional? Martha's expression was kind but frank. I think you should use every advantage available to you. Hammond is fair, but he's also a product of his time. A woman in trousers may seem less respectable. The word hung in the air between them, laden with all the social conventions and expectations that Eleanor had begun to shed during her brief time in Silver Creek. Part of her wanted to reject the strategy, to stand before the judge exactly as she was, practical, determined, unbound by Eastern proprieties. But another part recognized the wisdom in Martha's suggestion. This was not the time for personal statements, but for calculated advantage. "Thank you, Martha," she said finally, accepting the gift in the spirit it was offered. "It's perfect." After Martha left, Eleanor laid out the dress and then the trousers and shirt she'd worn to Providence. Two outward expressions of the same inner resolve, she realized. The choice was not between being strong or appearing conventional. It was about selecting the right tool for the task at hand. Tomorrow, she would face Judge Hammond, Victor Holloway, and the men prepared to testify against her claim. She would use every resource available to her, the ore samples, Thomas's letters, the inscribed watch and pendant, and yes, the social expectations that might work in her favor if properly leveraged. In the quiet of the night, Eleanor found herself thinking not of Thomas, but of the path that had led her here. The choices and circumstances that had transformed a Boston bookkeeper into a woman willing to fight for a silver mine in the Colorado wilderness. Whatever happened tomorrow, she knew she could not return to the life she had left behind. Silver Creek, Providence, the mountains themselves had changed her in ways too profound to reverse. As sleep finally claimed her, Eleanor's last conscious thought was of Jackson's words about the stars. The same stars, simply with nothing to hide them. Perhaps she, too, was the same Eleanor Hayes who had stepped onto that stagecoach in Boston, just with nothing left to hide the truth of who she really was. Dawn broke over Silver Creek with the clarity that comes only in mountain air, the rising sun painting the peaks in hues of gold and amber. Eleanor stood at the window of her small room, already dressed in Martha's altered blue gown, her hair arranged in a simple but elegant knot at the nape of her neck. The transformation was striking. Gone was the trail-worn woman in men's clothing, replaced by a figure of quiet dignity that would not have seemed out of place in a Boston drawing room. Only her hands, raw and reddened from 2 days of mining work, betrayed the truth of her recent activities. A soft knock at the door announced Martha, who entered carrying a pair of gloves. "These should help," she said, handing them to Eleanor. "The judge won't be looking too closely at your hands, but better not to invite scrutiny." Eleanor accepted the gloves gratefully, pulling them on over her calloused palms. "Thank you. For everything." Martha's eyes were kind but worried. "Henry spoke with Pritchard last night. He's nervous, but he'll testify that the ore samples match Thomas's previous submissions. It's something at least." "And the bank?" Eleanor asked, securing Thomas's watch to her belt and tucking it into a small pocket sewn into the dress. "Opens at 8. You'll have an hour before the hearing." Martha hesitated. "Eleanor, you should know. Holloway has been busy. He's invited every mine owner and businessman in Silver Creek to observe the proceedings. He's making a show of it." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. "Of course he is. He wants to establish that no one challenges his authority without consequences." She straightened her shoulders, drawing strength from the silver pendant concealed beneath. Her high collar. "Let him have his audience. It changes nothing." Jackson was waiting downstairs, and Eleanor noted with surprise that he, too, had made concessions to the occasion. His buckskins were replaced by clean trousers and a shirt that, while worn, had been carefully pressed. His hair was tied back neatly and his face freshly shaved. Only the revolver at his hip remained unchanged, a silent reminder of the stakes underlying the day's legal proceedings. His eyes widened slightly at her appearance, but he made no comment on the transformation. "The bank opens in 15 minutes, he said instead. "We should go." Silver Creek National Bank occupied one of the few brick buildings in town. Its solid construction, a statement of permanence in a place where most structures seemed temporary. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of paper and ink. The banker, a thin man named Abernathy, with spectacles perched precariously on his nose, greeted them with professional courtesy that cooled noticeably when Eleanor stated her business. A lockbox, you say? In Thomas Blackwood's name? He adjusted his spectacles, frowning slightly. And you claim to be his widow? Eleanor met his gaze steadily. I am his widow, Mr. Abernathy. We had arranged to be married upon my arrival, but Thomas died before I reached Silver Creek. Abernathy's frown deepened. That's not what I've heard, Mrs. Blackwood. There's talk that you never knew the man, that you're attempting to claim his property fraudulently. You've been speaking with Victor Holloway, Jackson observed, his tone neutral, but his posture subtly shifting to something more alert, more dangerous. The banker's eyes darted nervously between them. Mr. Holloway is a valued customer and a respected member of this community. His concerns carry weight. I'm sure they do, Eleanor replied, keeping her voice level. But consider this, Mr. Abernathy. If I were truly a fraud, how would I know about Thomas's lockbox? How would I have these? She removed Thomas's letters from her reticule, spreading several on the polished counter. Or this. She touched the silver pendant at her throat, drawing it out to display the crude heart with its inscription, "To Ellie, my providence." Abernathy examined the letters with obvious skepticism, but the pendant gave him pause. This is Blackwood's work, he admitted reluctantly. I recognize the style. He showed me similar pieces he'd fashioned from his first silver strikes. Eleanor pressed her advantage. Mr. Abernathy, I understand your caution, but surely there's a procedure for verifying my identity without requiring me to prove my entire case before the actual hearing. The banker hesitated, then sighed. There's a signature card. If you could reproduce Blackwood's signature. Eleanor's heart sank. She had never seen Thomas's signature, had only his letters written in a careful, somewhat labored hand. Before she could respond, Jackson stepped forward. That's unreasonable, and you know it, he said quietly. But Thomas left identifying. Questions for anyone claiming his property. Isn't that right, Abernathy? The banker's surprise was evident. How did you... Thomas and I discussed it, Jackson interrupted. A precaution, in case anything happened to him before his bride arrived. He set up a challenge question that only his intended would know the answer to. Eleanor glanced at Jackson, hoping her face didn't betray her confusion. This was the first she'd heard of any such arrangement. After a moment's hesitation, Abernathy nodded. There is such a question. He consulted a ledger, finding the appropriate page. Very well. The question is, what did the poet say about distant music? Eleanor blinked, momentarily bewildered. Then understanding dawned. Thomas's book of poetry, open on the table in the cabin, marked with a pressed flower. She closed her eyes, remembering the page, the verses underlined in Thomas's careful hand. Even after all this time, the sun never says to the earth, you owe me, she recited softly. Look what happens with a love like that. It lights the whole sky. Abernathy's eyes widened in genuine surprise. That's correct, he cleared his throat. I'll retrieve the lockbox. As the banker disappeared into the vault, Eleanor turned to Jackson, her voice low. How did you know? I didn't, he admitted. But I knew Thomas. He was careful, methodical. He would have planned for contingencies. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. And I know Abernathy. He's cautious to a fault, but he follows procedure religiously. If there was a way to access that lockbox legitimately, it would involve verification beyond just claiming to be Thomas's widow. Eleanor regarded him with newfound appreciation. That was a gamble. This whole venture is a gamble, Jackson replied simply. Abernathy returned carrying a small metal box, which he placed on the counter with obvious reluctance. You'll need to sign for this, Mrs. Blackwood, and I must inform you that removing it from the premises is not permitted." Eleanor signed the ledger, the name Eleanor Blackwood feeling strange beneath her pen, yet right in some indefinable way. She opened the lockbox with steady hands, aware of Abernathy's watchful gaze and the passing minutes before the hearing. Inside, she found exactly what they had hoped for. Thomas's journal, bound in leather and filled with his distinctive handwriting, detailed maps of the Providence claim showing the silver vein and his excavation progress, and perhaps most valuable of all, a formal letter from the Territorial Mining Office confirming his ownership and the claim's good standing. But there was something else, something unexpected, a sealed letter addressed simply to "My Ellie." Eleanor stared at it, her throat suddenly tight. Thomas's last words to her, perhaps, written in anticipation of a meeting that would never occur. "We need to go," Jackson said gently, his voice breaking through her daze. "The hearing starts in 20 minutes." Eleanor nodded, carefully returning the letter to the lockbox. There would be time later for private grief. Now she needed clarity and focus. "I'll need to take these documents with me, Mr. Abernathy," she said, indicating the journal, maps and mining office letter. "As I said, removing items from the lockbox is normally prohibited, yes," Eleanor interrupted smoothly. "But these are essential evidence in a legal proceeding commencing in—" She glanced at Thomas's watch. 18 minutes. "Surely the bank's regulations make allowances for court orders?" Abernathy frowned. "There's no court order." "Not yet," Eleanor agreed. "But Judge Hammond will certainly issue one when I inform him that vital evidence is being withheld." "How? Would that reflect on the bank, I wonder? On your judgment specifically?" The banker's face flushed. "That sounds like a threat, Mrs. Blackwood." "Not at all," Eleanor replied, her tone pleasant but firm. "Merely an observation about the probable course of events. I'm simply offering you the opportunity to demonstrate the bank's commitment to cooperation with legal authorities." After a moment's tense silence, Abernathy sighed. "You may take the documents, provided they remain in the courthouse and are returned to the bank by close of business today. I'll need your signature acknowledging these conditions." "Of course," Eleanor agreed, signing the form he produced. As they left the bank, documents secured in her reticule, she caught Jackson watching her with an expression that might have been amusement. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he replied. "Just thinking Thomas chose better than he knew." The Silver Creek Courthouse was actually the upper floor of the Silver Dollar Saloon, temporarily transformed for the circuit judge's visit. By the time Eleanor and Jackson arrived, the room was already crowded with spectators, miners in their rough work clothes, businessmen in suits similar to Holloway's, and a few curious women from the town. Victor Holloway sat at a table near the front, accompanied by a thin man in an expensive Eastern suit who Eleanor assumed was his lawyer. Silas. Mercer and the Fleming brothers lounged against the back wall, their postures casual, but their eyes alert and hostile. 3 other men, the supposed witnesses, sat together on a bench, looking uncomfortable in clean shirts that seemed foreign to their sun-weathered frames. Martha and Henry Wilson had saved seats for Eleanor and Jackson in the front row. "Quite the audience," Henry murmured as they sat down. "Holloway's been busy spreading his version of events." Before Eleanor could respond, a door at the front of the room opened, and a court clerk announced, "All rise for the Honorable Judge William Hammond." The judge was a surprise, younger than Eleanor had expected, perhaps in his early 40s, with a neatly trimmed beard and intelligent eyes that missed nothing as he surveyed the crowded room. He wore his authority with an ease that suggested both competence and a healthy disregard for pretension. "Be seated," he ordered, taking his place at the bench. "This court is now in session." He consulted the papers before him. First case, Holloway versus Blackwood, regarding ownership of the mining claim known as Providence. Mr. Kellerman, you're representing the petitioner? Holloway's lawyer rose. Yes, Your Honor. Stephen Kellerman, representing Mr. Victor Holloway, in his petition to reclaim the Providence claim from an individual fraudulently asserting ownership rights. Hammond's gaze shifted to Eleanor. And you are? Eleanor stood, conscious of every eye in the room upon her. Eleanor Blackwood, Your Honor, widow of Thomas Blackwood and rightful owner of the Providence claim. I see. The judge studied her thoughtfully. You're representing yourself, Mrs. Blackwood? Yes, Your Honor. I believe the facts of the case will speak for themselves. Hammond nodded, seeming neither approving nor disapproving of her choice. Very well, Mr. Kellerman, present your petition. What followed was a carefully constructed narrative painting Eleanor as an opportunistic imposter who had arrived in Silver Creek days after Thomas Blackwood's death, falsely claiming to be his wife in order to seize valuable property. Kellerman presented the three miners as witnesses, each testifying that in months of working alongside Thomas, they had never heard him mention a wife or fiancée. Furthermore, Kellerman continued, the respondent has no knowledge of mining, no capability to work the claim, and no legitimate connection to the deceased. The claim should rightfully revert to Mr. Holloway, who had been in negotiations to purchase it prior to Blackwood's unfortunate accident. Eleanor listened without interruption, noting how skillfully Kellerman wove truth and falsehood together. When he finally concluded, Judge Hammond turned to her. Mrs. Blackwood, you may present your case. Eleanor rose, clutching Thomas's journal in her hands. Thank you, Your Honor. I'll be brief. I arrived in Silver Creek expecting to marry Thomas Blackwood, with whom I had corresponded for nearly a year. She placed several of Thomas's letters on the judge's bench. These are his letters to me, detailing his work at Providence and his preparations for our future together. Hammond examined the letters carefully, his expression neutral. These establish correspondence, Mrs. Blackwood, but not your claim to marriage or property rights. I understand, Your Honor, which is why I've brought these as well. Eleanor presented Thomas's journal and the maps from the lockbox. These were secured in Thomas's bank lockbox, accessed this morning using information only his intended wife would know. The journal details his discovery of silver at Providence, his development of the claim, and his plans for our future there. Hammond's eyebrows rose slightly as he took the journal. This is substantial documentation, Mrs. Blackwood. But Mr. Kellerman's point about your ability to work the claim remains valid. Mining is not typically considered women's work. Eleanor gestured to Jackson. I've retained Jackson Walker, who partnered with Thomas in identifying the claim location, to assist with the technical aspects of mining. However, I've also begun learning the work myself. She opened a small pouch, displaying the ore samples they had collected. These specimens were extracted by my own hand from Providence yesterday, under Mr. Walker's guidance. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Kellerman rose quickly. Your Honor, these claims are preposterous. The woman arrived days ago, has no mining experience. And yet, Hammond interrupted mildly, examining one of the ore samples, she appears to have successfully extracted high-grade silver ore. That suggests some capability, wouldn't you agree? Anyone can pick up rocks, Your Honor, Kellerman scoffed. That hardly constitutes mining expertise. Eleanor turned to the crowd. Mr. Pritchard, could you please step forward? The assayer rose nervously, making his way to the front of the room. Mr. Pritchard, you've processed ore samples from the Providence claim before, is that correct? Eleanor asked. Yes, ma'am, many times for Mr. Blackwood. And these samples I've presented today, how would you characterize them in comparison to Thomas's previous submissions? Pritchard cleared his throat. They're consistent in quality and mineral composition. Same vein, I'd say. Thank you. Mr. Pritchard, Eleanor turned back to Hammond. "Your Honor, I recognize that my situation is unconventional. I came to Silver Creek expecting to begin a life with Thomas Blackwood. His death was a tragedy I'm still coming to terms with. But in the days since my arrival, I've come to understand why Providence meant so much to him, not just for its silver, but for what it represented. Independence, honest work, a future built with one's own hands." She touched the pendant at her throat. "Thomas made this for me from the first silver he extracted from Providence. He called it his lucky strike. He believed that Providence was meant for us, and I intend to honor that belief by continuing what he started." Hammond was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful as he turned the pages of Thomas's journal. "Mr. Kellerman, does your client have any prior claim to this property beyond his interest in purchasing it?" Kellerman hesitated. "No, Your Honor, but..." "And Mrs. Blackwood has presented substantial evidence of her connection to the deceased and her intention to work the claim," Hammond continued. "She has secured knowledgeable assistance and has already begun production, as evidenced by these samples." The judge set the journal down and looked directly at Eleanor. "Mrs. Blackwood, the circumstances of your arrival and claim are unusual, and I sympathize with the position you find yourself in. However, the law requires certainty, particularly in matters of property." He paused. "I'll reserve judgment until tomorrow morning. In the meantime, I'd like to visit this Providence claim myself to assess its viability and your preparations firsthand." Eleanor's heart leaped. A site visit would allow Hammond to see the sabotaged support beams, the work she and Jackson had begun, the cabin Thomas had built for her. "I would welcome that, Your Honor," Hammond nodded. "We'll depart in 1 hour. Court is adjourned until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, at which time I'll render my decision." As the crowd began to disperse, Eleanor became aware of Holloway watching her from across the room, his expression coldly calculating. He made his way toward her, his lawyer trailing behind. "An impressive performance, Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his voice pitched low for her ears alone. "Touching even, but ultimately futile." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Your confidence seems premature, Mr. Holloway, considering the judge has yet to rule." Holloway's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Hammond is a reasonable man. He understands how things work in Silver Creek, how they must work for progress to continue." He leaned closer. "This isn't Boston, Mrs. Blackwood. Here, a woman alone has few protections, few allies. It would be a shame if, after all this effort, you found yourself truly alone." The threat was unmistakable. Eleanor felt Jackson stiffen beside her, but she laid a restraining hand on his arm. "I appreciate your concern for my welfare, Mr. Holloway," she replied coolly. "But as you've noted, this isn't Boston. Here I find I can breathe more freely, think more clearly, and recognize threats for what they are. The last resort of a man who knows his legal case is weak." Holloway's expression hardened. "You've made your choice, then?" "I have." Eleanor agreed. "Just as Thomas did when he refused to sell Providence to you. I look forward to Judge Hammond's decision tomorrow." As Holloway stalked away, Martha approached, her face tight with worry. "That man," she murmured. "Be careful, Eleanor. He doesn't take defeat gracefully." "I'm counting on it," Eleanor replied, watching Holloway confer with Mercer near the exit. "His anger makes him predictable." An hour later, a small party assembled for the ride to Providence. Judge Hammond, Eleanor, Jackson, and at Kellerman's insistence, Holloway himself. The journey was made largely in silence, with Hammond occasionally asking questions about the terrain or the history of mining in the area. As they approached Providence, Eleanor watched the judge's reaction carefully. Hammond was observant, noting the carefully constructed cabin, the beginnings of proper mining infrastructure, and the efforts already made to secure and develop the site. Inside the mine, Jackson guided them to the collapsed main tunnel, explaining Thomas's excavation plan and pointing out the new work they had begun on the secondary passage. Hammond examined the silver vein with experienced eyes, asked detailed questions about extraction methods and plans for processing the ore. "And this collapse," he said, gesturing to the blocked main tunnel, "a natural occurrence?" Eleanor exchanged glances with Jackson. "We believe not, Your Honor," she said carefully. "If you examine the remaining support beams, you'll notice they've been partially cut through. Not enough to fail immediately, but enough to ensure eventual collapse when the vibrations of mining weaken them further." Hammond frowned, inspecting one of the compromised beams with his fingers. "This appears deliberate," he agreed. "You're suggesting sabotage." "I'm suggesting that Thomas Blackwood was an experienced miner who took proper safety precautions," Eleanor replied. "His death was not the result of carelessness or natural causes." Hammond's gaze shifted to Holloway, who stood at the tunnel entrance, his expression carefully neutral. "Serious allegations, Mrs. Blackwood. Do you have proof of who might have committed such an act?" "Only circumstances, Your Honor. Thomas refused to sell the claim to Mr. Holloway. Shortly thereafter, the support beams were compromised, and he was killed in the resulting collapse." Holloway stepped forward. "This is outrageous, Your Honor. The woman is desperate and making wild accusations without a shred of evidence." Hammond held up a hand. "I'm not here to adjudicate a murder investigation, Mr. Holloway. My concern is solely with the ownership of this claim." He turned back to Eleanor. "Show me what you've accomplished since taking possession." For the next hour, Eleanor guided Hammond through their recent work, the ore they had extracted, the plans for extending the secondary tunnel, the improvements to the sorting area. Jackson demonstrated proper mining techniques, and Eleanor showed that she could handle the basics, tools with growing competence. "You've made a start," Hammond acknowledged as they prepared to leave. "But mining is a demanding business, Mrs. Blackwood. It requires capital, labor, and expertise. All of which I'm prepared to develop or secure, Your Honor," Eleanor replied. "Thomas believed in Providence. I'm asking for the chance to prove his faith was justified." The ride back to Silver Creek was subdued, each person absorbed in their own thoughts. Eleanor felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. Hammond had seemed impressed by the mine's potential and her determination, but he was clearly concerned about her ability to succeed in such a male-dominated industry. As they reached the outskirts of town, Hammond pulled his horse alongside hers. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said quietly, "regardless of my decision tomorrow, I commend your courage. Few would undertake what you have in similar circumstances." Eleanor inclined her head, recognizing both the compliment and its limitations. "Thank you, Your Honor, but I didn't come to Silver Creek seeking commendation for courage. I came seeking a future. That hasn't changed, despite Thomas's death." Hammond studied her thoughtfully. "Indeed," he murmured, before urging his horse forward. Back at the Wilson store, Eleanor found Martha waiting anxiously. "How did it go?" she asked. "As soon as they were alone?" "As well as could be expected," Eleanor replied, sinking gratefully into a chair. The long ride and the tension of the day had left her exhausted. Hammond was thorough, fair, but non-committal. Martha nodded, pouring a cup of tea and placing it before Eleanor. "That's his reputation. Keeps his judgments close until he's ready to pronounce them." She hesitated. "There's something else you should know. While you were gone, Silas Mercer and the Fleming boys were asking questions around town, about Jackson mainly, where he goes, who he associates with." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the teacup. "They're planning something." "I think so," Martha agreed grimly. Holloway wouldn't risk moving against you directly, not while Hammond is here. But Jackson is different. He's half Ute, has no family connections in town. If something were to happen to him, there would be few questions asked, Eleanor finished, anger coiling in her chest. We need to warn him. Henry's already gone to find him, Martha assured her. But Eleanor, you should be prepared. If Hammond rules in your favor tomorrow, Holloway won't simply accept defeat. He'll find another way to force you out. Eleanor nodded slowly, her mind already racing ahead to contingencies, strategies. No, but first we need to survive tonight. She rose, setting the untouched tea aside. I should find Jackson, make sure he understands the danger. She found him at the livery stable, checking the horses they would need for tomorrow's return to Providence after the ruling. He listened to her warning without surprise, his hands continuing their methodical work on the saddle he was repairing. Mercer's been watching me since I arrived in Silver Creek 4 years ago, he said simply. Nothing new there. This is different, Eleanor insisted. If Hammond rules in my favor tomorrow, Holloway will be desperate to prevent us from developing Providence. You're the one with the mining knowledge, the skills I need. Without you, the claim becomes much harder to work, Jackson finished. He set the saddle aside, finally giving her his full attention. I understand the risk, Eleanor. I've lived with it most of my life. Being caught between worlds means never being fully protected by either. Eleanor studied his face, noting the quiet resignation in his expression, the acceptance of a reality she was only beginning to comprehend. It's not right, she said softly. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. No, but it is what is. He picked up a revolver from the workbench beside him, checking its chambers methodically. I'll be careful, and so should you. As Eleanor turned to leave, Jackson called after her. Eleanor. She paused, looking back at him. Whatever Hammond decides tomorrow, you've already won something important. What's that? She asked. You've shown Holloway, shown everyone, that you can't be intimidated. That matters in a place like this. Eleanor considered this, thinking of the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach just days ago, grief-stricken and uncertain. Perhaps, she acknowledged, but it's not enough. Not yet. That night, Eleanor retrieved Thomas's personal letter from the bank lockbox, bringing it back to her room at the Wilsons. For hours, she sat with it unopened, turning the sealed envelope over in her hands. It represented the last direct connection to Thomas, his final words to her, and she found herself both longing to read them and afraid of the finality they represented. Finally, as the lamp burned low, she broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper. My dearest Ellie, the letter began in Thomas's careful hand. If you're reading this, then something has happened to me before we could meet. I've asked Jackson to ensure this reaches you, along with the journal and maps that will prove your right to Providence. The claim is rich, richer than I've let anyone know. The main vein extends deeper than my official filings indicate. I've marked the true extent in the journal. That knowledge has made my position dangerous. Holloway suspects, but he can't be certain without access to my records. I'm sorry for what this means for the future we planned, but know this, you are strong enough to succeed here, with or without me. I recognize that strength in your letters, in your willingness to leave everything familiar for an uncertain future. Providence was never just a mine to me. It was the belief that some things are meant to be, that paths cross for a reason. Our paths were meant to cross, Ellie, even if our time together has been cut short. The letter ended with a simple closing. Yours in this life and whatever comes after, Thomas. Eleanor read the letter twice more, tears blurring her vision. Then she carefully refolded it and placed it in her reticule alongside the silver pendant. Thomas had believed in her strength before he'd ever met her. Tomorrow, she would need to prove that belief justified, not just to Judge Hammond, but to Silver Creek, to Holloway, and perhaps most importantly, to herself. Outside her window, Silver Creek had grown quiet, most of its inhabitants long since retired for the night. But Eleanor knew that somewhere in the darkness, plans were being laid by Holloway and his men, by Jackson as he prepared his defenses, by forces set in motion the moment she had decided to stay and fight for what was rightfully hers. Tomorrow would bring Hammond's decision, but it would not bring an end to the struggle. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter in a story that had started with Thomas's letters and would continue through her own determination. Whatever happened, Eleanor knew with sudden clarity that she would not be returning east. Silver Creek, with all its dangers and possibilities, had become her battleground, and Providence, with its hidden wealth and the promise of independence it represented, was worth the fight. As she finally prepared for bed, Eleanor found herself thinking not of Thomas or the hearing, or even the dangers that might lie ahead, but of the land itself, the towering mountains, the clear streams, the forests that whispered with ancient voices. This wild country demanded strength from those who sought to claim it, but it also offered rewards beyond mere silver or gold. It offered the chance to discover who you truly were, stripped of society's expectations and constraints. And whatever else happened, Eleanor realized that discovery alone was worth the journey she had undertaken. The courthouse was already filled to capacity when Eleanor arrived the next morning, the crowd spilling out onto the wooden sidewalk. Word of the dispute had spread throughout Silver Creek, drawing not just the usual spectators, but miners from outlying claims, curious about the woman challenging Victor Holloway. Eleanor made her way through the press of bodies, acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed her. Today, she had chosen to wear the blue dress again, but with small changes. Her hair was secured in a practical braid rather than an elegant knot, and Thomas's silver pendant hung openly at her throat, catching the light as she moved. Henry and Martha Wilson had saved seats in the front row, but there was no sign of Jackson. Eleanor scanned the room anxiously, remembering Martha's warning from the night before. Holloway sat at his table looking unconcerned, exchanging quiet words with his lawyer. Mercer and one of the Fleming brothers lounged near the back, but the younger Fleming was conspicuously absent. "Have you seen Jackson?" Eleanor whispered to Martha as she took her seat. Martha shook her head, her expression worried. "Not since. Early this morning, Henry said he was making preparations at the livery, but he should have been here by now." Eleanor felt a cold knot form in her stomach. It could be nothing, a delayed errand, a minor problem with the horses. But the absence of the younger Fleming brother suggested otherwise. Before she could voice her concerns, the court clerk called for order and Judge Hammond entered the room. His expression was grave as he took his seat at the bench, surveying the crowded room with sharp eyes. "These proceedings will come to order," he announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Having reviewed the evidence and testimonies presented yesterday, and having personally inspected the mining claim in question, I am prepared to render my decision in the matter of Holloway versus Blackwood." The room fell silent, tension thick, enough to touch. Eleanor sat very straight, her hands folded in her lap to hide their slight tremor. Everything hinged on these next moments: her future in Silver Creek, her ability to honor Thomas's legacy, her chance to forge a life of independence. Hammond cleared his throat. "This case presents unusual circumstances," he began. "The respondent, Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, arrived in Silver Creek following the death of Thomas Blackwood, claiming rights to his mining claim based on their intended marriage. The petitioner, Mr. Victor Holloway, challenges this claim on grounds that no legal marriage existed and that Mrs. Blackwood lacks the capability to develop the property effectively. The judge shuffled his papers, continuing, after careful consideration of all evidence presented, including the deceased's personal writings, official claim registration, and the respondent's demonstrated commitment to developing the property, I find in favor of Mrs. Blackwood. A collective gasp went through the room, followed by a buzz of conversation. Eleanor's heart leaped, but she kept her expression composed, aware of Holloway's eyes boring into her from across the room. Hammond raised his hand for silence. Let me clarify the basis for this ruling. While no formal marriage ceremony took place, Thomas Blackwood's written intentions, combined with Mrs. Blackwood's journey to fulfill those intentions, constitute what frontier law recognizes as a marriage by intention. Furthermore, Mrs. Blackwood has demonstrated both the commitment and the capacity to develop the providence claim, having already begun extraction operations with qualified assistance. He turned his gaze directly to Eleanor. Mrs. Blackwood, this court recognizes your rightful ownership of the providence claim as Thomas Blackwood's widow and heir. You are granted all rights and responsibilities thereof, effective immediately. Then he looked to Holloway. Mr. Holloway, your petition is denied. Court costs are assigned to the petitioner. He banged his gavel once. This matter is resolved. Court is adjourned until 2 o'clock, at which time we'll hear the case of Turner versus the Silver Creek Banking Company. As the crowd began to disperse, a mixture of reactions filling the room, Martha squeezed Eleanor's hand. You did it, she whispered. But Eleanor's thoughts were already racing ahead. The legal battle was won, but the real fight was just beginning. And Jackson's continued absence filled her with growing dread. Holloway approached, his composure intact despite the defeat. Congratulations, Mrs. Blackwood, he said, his voice carrying just the right note of gracious concession. You've won an impressive victory today. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. Thank you, Mr. Holloway. I trust this concludes our business matters. His smile was cold. For now, though I wonder if your victory will seem quite so sweet when you realize the price it carries. He glanced around the room. Your Indian friend seems to have abandoned you already. Wise of him, perhaps. Eleanor's hand tightened around the silver pendant. Where is he, Holloway? What have you done? I? Holloway's expression was one of injured innocence. I've been here all morning, as dozens of witnesses can attest. If Mr. Walker has encountered some difficulty, it has nothing to do with me. He tipped his hat. Good day, Mrs. Blackwood. I do hope you'll be careful at that mine of yours. The mountains can be so treacherous for those who don't understand their dangers. As he walked away, Henry appeared at Eleanor's side. I don't like this, he muttered. Jackson wouldn't miss the ruling unless something was very wrong. Eleanor nodded, already moving toward the door. I'm going to find him. Will you check the livery? I'll try. His cabin. Jackson's home was on the outskirts of town, a small but well-built structure that reflected his mixed heritage. Sturdy logs in the Western style, but with distinctive Ute elements in its construction and the arrangement of the sparse furnishings. Eleanor had never visited before, but Martha had described its location. She approached cautiously, her hand near the revolver, hidden in the folds of her dress. The cabin appeared deserted. No smoke from the chimney despite the morning chill, no movement within or around the structure. Reaching the door, she called Jackson's name, receiving only silence in response. After a moment's hesitation, she tried the latch. It opened easily. Inside, the cabin was neat and orderly, but with signs of a hasty departure. A half-empty cup of coffee on the table, a blanket tossed aside on the narrow bed. Nothing suggested violence or struggle, which offered some small comfort. Perhaps Jackson had simply been called away urgently, but to where and why? As Eleanor turned to leave, something caught her eye, a small piece of paper partially concealed beneath the coffee cup. She pulled it free, finding a crude map sketched in charcoal. It showed a trail leading from Silver Creek into the mountains, marked with an X near what appeared to be Devil's Gulch, a treacherous canyon passed between Silver Creek and the next settlement west. Beneath the map was a single word: ambush. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Whether Jackson had drawn this warning or received it, the meaning was clear. Someone had planned an attack, likely targeting their return journey to Providence after the hearing. But if that was the case, where was Jackson now? The sound of approaching hoofbeats sent her hurrying to the window. Henry Wilson was riding toward the cabin, his expression urgent. Eleanor met him outside, the map clutched in her hand. "Any sign of him at the livery?" she asked immediately. Henry shook his head. "The horses are gone, both his and yours, and Wyatt Fleming hasn't been seen since last night." He dismounted, examining the map Eleanor held. "What's this?" She explained her theory about the planned ambush. "I think Jackson discovered their plan and went to stop it, or..." She hesitated, the alternative too disturbing to voice. "Or they took him," Henry finished grimly, "forced him to guide them to a suitable location." He studied the map more closely. Devil's Gulch would be perfect for an ambush. Narrow trail, high walls, no escape route. Eleanor's mind was already calculating distances, time. "How far is it? Could we reach it before..." "It's at least 2 hours' ride," Henry interrupted. "And Eleanor, you can't seriously be thinking of going after them. Mercer and the Flemings are killers. If they have Jackson, then he needs help," Eleanor said firmly. "And I won't abandon him, not after everything he's done for me, for Thomas." Henry ran a hand through his thinning hair, clearly torn. "The sheriff from Coopersville is due this afternoon to transport a prisoner. If we wait..." "Jackson might not have that long," Eleanor cut in. "And you know as well as I do that no lawman is going to risk his life for a half-Ute guide on the word of an Eastern widow." She straightened her shoulders. "I'm going, with or without help." Henry was silent for a long moment. Then he sighed, resignation in his voice. "Martha will never forgive me if I let you go alone. Wait here. I'll get supplies and another horse." While Henry was gone, Eleanor returned to the cabin, searching for anything that might give her more information. In a small trunk beneath Jackson's bed, she found what she was looking for: ammunition for her revolver, a spare knife, and a spyglass that would prove useful in scouting the gulch. She changed quickly into the practical clothes she'd worn. To Providence, securing her hair tightly and checking the revolver's action. By the time Henry returned with a second horse and saddlebags full of supplies, she was ready. The ride to Devil's Gulch was made in grim silence, both of them acutely aware of the dangers ahead. Eleanor used the time to prepare herself mentally, reviewing everything Jackson had taught her about handling her weapon, about moving quietly through wilderness, about staying calm in the face of threat. As they approached the gulch, Henry signaled for them to stop in a sheltered grove of pines. "We need to proceed carefully from here," he whispered. "The gulch is just beyond that ridgeline. If they're waiting in ambush, they'll have lookouts." Eleanor nodded, retrieving the spyglass from her saddlebag. "I'll climb to that outcropping," she said, pointing to a rocky formation that would provide a view into the gulch without exposing her position. "See what we're dealing with." Henry looked like he wanted to object, but nodded instead. "Be careful. Don't expose yourself unnecessarily." The climb was more difficult than Eleanor had anticipated, the rocks loose and treacherous under her boots. But she moved methodically, testing each handhold before trusting her weight to it, her determination driving her upward despite scraped palms and aching muscles. Finally reaching a position with a clear view, she raised the spyglass carefully, scanning the length of the gulch. It was as Henry had described, a narrow passage with steep walls rising on either side, perfect for an ambush. About halfway through, she spotted movement, horses tethered in a small side canyon, partially hidden from the main trail. Adjusting the focus, she counted 3 horses, then 4. And there, a figure sitting against the canyon wall, hands bound behind his back. Jackson. Relief flooded through her at the sight of him alive, but it was tempered by the reality of their situation. 3 armed men against her and Henry, in terrain of their choosing. She continued her survey, locating Mercer and the elder Fleming brother stationed on a ledge overlooking the trail, rifles at the ready. The younger Fleming was likely guarding Jackson, though she couldn't see him from her angle. Carefully, Eleanor made her way back down to where Henry waited. "They have Jackson," she reported in a low voice. "He's alive, bound in a side canyon. Mercer and Caleb Fleming are positioned on a ledge with rifles. I couldn't see Wyatt, but he's likely guarding Jackson." Henry's expression was grim. "They're expecting us to ride straight into their trap." "Then we won't," Eleanor said simply. She spread Jackson's map on a flat rock, studying it intently. "There must be another way into that side canyon, something less obvious than the main trail." Henry traced the contours of the map with a weathered finger. "Maybe here," he said, indicating a faint line that seemed to wind around the back of the gulch. "It would be rough going, but it might bring us in behind them." Eleanor nodded decisively. "That's our plan, then. You create a distraction on the main trail while I work my way around to free Jackson." "That's too dangerous," Henry protested. "If anything happens to you, then I'll have died fighting for someone who would have done the same for me," Eleanor interrupted. "We don't have time to argue, Henry. If we wait for reinforcements, it will be too late." Jackson knew the risks. "When he became involved with my claim against Holloway, so do I." After a moment's tense silence, Henry nodded. "I'll draw their attention to the main trail in exactly 30 minutes. That should give you time to reach position. If you're not, back with Jackson in 1 hour. I'm coming in after you both." D. The secondary trail proved to be little more than a game path, forcing Eleanor to dismount and lead her horse through dense underbrush and over rocky terrain that threatened to snap an ankle with each step. But she moved steadily, timing her progress carefully, aware that Henry's life and Jackson's depended on precise coordination. As she neared the side canyon where Jackson was being held, Eleanor secured her horse to a sturdy pine and continued on foot, moving as silently as Jackson had taught her during their time at Providence. The revolver was a comforting weight at her hip, though she hoped she wouldn't need to use it. The sound of voices drifted to her on the still air as she approached the canyon entrance. "Waste of time," someone was saying. The younger Fleming, she guessed. "She's probably halfway back to Boston by now." "Holloway wants her stopped," came Mercer's gruff reply. "Permanently. Says she's too much of a liability now that she's got legal standing with that claim." "And what about him?" Fleming again, presumably indicating Jackson. "Him too, for interfering, for being a breed. Take your pick." Eleanor's blood ran cold at the casual brutality in Mercer's voice. This wasn't just about intimidation or driving her away from Providence. Holloway had ordered her death, and Jackson's to eliminate any challenge to his control of Silver Creek's mining interests. She checked her pocket watch. 3 minutes until Henry's distraction. Peering carefully around a boulder, she finally got a clear view of the situation. Jackson sat against the canyon wall, his hands bound behind him, a bruise darkening one cheekbone, but otherwise appearing unharmed. Wyatt Fleming paced nearby, a rifle slung over his shoulder, while Mercer stood at the canyon entrance, scanning the main trail through the gulch. The older Fleming brother was nowhere in sight, presumably still at his post on the ledge overlooking the main trail. That meant she would be facing 2 armed men once Henry drew the third away. Not ideal odds, but better than they'd had moments ago. The echo of a gunshot reverberated through the gulch, followed quickly by a second, Henry's distraction right on schedule. "That's them!" Mercer shouted, gesturing to the elder Fleming somewhere out of sight. "Get ready!" Wyatt Fleming moved to join Mercer at the canyon entrance, raising his rifle to peer through the sight. Both men's attention was fixed on the main trail, their backs to Jackson and to Eleanor. It was now or never. Drawing her revolver, Eleanor stepped out from behind the boulder. "Drop your weapons," she commanded, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Or I'll put a bullet in Mr. Mercer's spine." Both men froze. Slowly, Mercer began to turn. "Don't," Eleanor warned, cocking the hammer for emphasis. "I'm not a very experienced shot, Mr. Mercer. My hands might tremble. The bullet might go wide, into your kidney perhaps, or your lung. Either way, it would be an excruciating way to die." Jackson's eyes had widened at her appearance, but his expression quickly shifted to one of grim satisfaction. He began working at his bonds with renewed vigor. "Well, well," Mercer drawled, carefully keeping his back to her as instructed. "Mrs. Blackwood herself. Holloway said you had spine, but I didn't believe it." He chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. "You should have taken his offer and gone back east. Now you'll never leave these mountains." "Lower your rifles to the ground," Eleanor ordered, ignoring the threat. "Slowly, then step away from them." Mercer complied with exaggerated care, his movements deliberate, but Wyatt Fleming hesitated, his shoulders tensing in a way that sent alarm racing through Eleanor. "Now, Fleming," she snapped, "or your friend bleeds out in the dirt." Reluctantly, Fleming lowered his rifle. But as he bent to place it on the ground, he suddenly spun, bringing the weapon up toward Eleanor in one fluid motion. She fired without conscious thought, the revolver's report deafening in the confined space. Fleming staggered, surprise replacing the hatred on his face as he looked down at the spreading crimson stain on his chest. He took one stumbling step forward before collapsing face first onto the rocky ground. Taking advantage of Eleanor's momentary shock, Mercer lunged for his own discarded rifle. She swung the revolver toward him, but before she could fire, Jackson, who had finally freed himself, tackled Mercer from behind, driving him into the dirt. The two men grappled fiercely, each fighting with the knowledge that defeat meant death. Eleanor circled them, looking for a clear shot, but they were too entangled, rolling in the dust as each sought advantage. Mercer was larger, stronger, but Jackson fought with the desperation of a man who had faced frontier justice before and knew its brutal inequity. Finally, Jackson managed to pin Mercer face down, twisting one arm behind his back at an unnatural angle. "The knife," he gasped to Eleanor, nodding toward Wyatt Fleming's still form, "in his belt." Eleanor hesitated only a moment before retrieving the knife from the dead man's belt, trying not to look at his vacant eyes or the blood still seeping into the thirsty earth. She handed the blade to Jackson, who pressed it against Mercer's throat, with enough pressure to draw a thin line of blood. "Call off Caleb," Jackson ordered, his voice low and dangerous. "Tell him to throw down his rifle or you die right here." Mercer's laugh was more of a wheeze with Jackson's weight on his back. "You won't kill me, Breed. You don't have the stomach for it." Jackson increased the pressure of the blade, his expression cold. "Maybe not before today, but after what you planned for Eleanor, for me, try me." Something in his tone must have convinced Mercer, because the bravado drained from his face. "Caleb," he shouted, his voice echoing off the canyon walls, "stand down! Throw down your rifle!" There was a long moment of silence, broken only by the sound of distant hoofbeats. Henry, likely circling back to their position after creating his distraction. Then came the clatter of a rifle being tossed onto rocky ground from the ledge above. "Come down with your hands visible," Jackson called out. "Any sudden moves, and your brother's employer gets a second smile beneath his chin." Minutes later, they had both Mercer and the elder Fleming secured with their own belts and ropes, disarmed and sullen in defeat. Henry arrived, wide-eyed at the scene before him, one man dead, two captive, Eleanor standing with the revolver still in her hand, and an expression of shocked determination on her face. "Are you hurt?" he asked her urgently. She shook her head, suddenly aware of how badly her hands were shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. "Jackson was their target all along," she said. "A way to get to me. Holloway ordered both. Of us killed?" Henry's expression hardened. "We need to get these two back to Silver Creek. Judge Hammond is still there. With his authority and 3 witnesses, even Holloway won't be able to slither away from this." The journey back to town was tense, their prisoners bound and mounted on their own horses, Wyatt Fleming's body draped over the saddle of the 4th. Jackson rode beside Eleanor, his expression unreadable, though she occasionally caught him watching her with something like wonderment in his eyes. "You killed a man," he said finally, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "For me." Eleanor stared at her hands on the reins, still unable to fully process what she had done. "I didn't intend to," she said softly. "But when he turned, with that rifle, I didn't think. I just acted." Jackson nodded. "First time is the hardest," he said, not unkindly. "It changes you, makes you see the world differently." "Does it get easier?" she asked, not sure which answer she dreaded more. "It shouldn't," he replied simply. "The day taking a life becomes easy is the day you become something you don't want to be." They rode in silence after that, each lost in private thoughts. Eleanor found herself remembering Thomas's letter, his belief in her strength, his certainty that she could forge a life in this harsh land. He couldn't have envisioned this, her hands stained with a man's blood. Her future now irrevocably tied to Silver Creek, not just by property, but by an act that could never be undone. By the time they reached town, word of their approach had spread. A crowd gathered on the main street, watching as they delivered their prisoners to the makeshift jail beneath the Silver Dollar Saloon. Judge Hammond, alerted to their arrival, met them there, his expression grave as he took in the captives and Fleming's body. "What happened?" he demanded. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice steadier than she felt. "These men ambushed Mr. Walker, on orders from Victor Holloway, intending to kill us both and prevent us from developing the Providence claim. We have Jackson's testimony to that effect, as well as statements I overheard personally from Mr. Mercer." Hammond's eyes narrowed. "Serious allegations, Mrs. Blackwood, though the circumstances certainly suggest foul play." He turned to Mercer. "What do you say to these charges?" Mercer spat on the ground. "The breed attacked us. Fleming was defending himself when the woman shot him. That's all. 3 armed men just happened to be waiting in an isolated canyon." Hammond asked skeptically, "And Mr. Walker just happened to be their prisoner?" He shook his head. "Your story lacks credibility, Mr. Mercer. You and Mr. Fleming will remain in custody until the circuit prosecutor arrives to formally charge you." And Holloway?" Jackson asked. "He gave the orders." Hammond sighed, proving that will be more difficult without his direct involvement. "But if either of these men testifies against him in exchange for leniency..." He left the implication hanging. "In the meantime, I suggest you both watch your backs. Men like Holloway rarely accept defeat gracefully." As if summoned by his name, Victor Holloway appeared at the edge of the crowd, his expression a careful mask of concern. "Judge Hammond," he called, approaching with measured steps. "I've just heard about this terrible business. What's happened?" Eleanor watched him with newfound clarity, seeing not just the polished exterior, but the ruthless calculation beneath. This was a man who had ordered her death as casually as one might order a drink, who had built his empire on intimidation and violence thinly veiled by legal maneuvering. And he believed even now that his position would protect him from consequences. "Mr. Holloway," Hammond greeted him, his tone neutral. "We were just discussing an alleged murder conspiracy targeting Mrs. Blackwood and Mr. Walker. Mrs. Blackwood claims these men were acting on your instructions." Holloway's expression registered shock, with practiced precision. My instructions? That's preposterous. While I certainly contested Mrs. Blackwood's claim legally, I would never resort to violence. These men are not in my employ. Liar, Mercer snarled suddenly. You ordered the hit yourself. Said the woman and the breed needed to disappear permanently. Said you'd make sure we never saw the inside of a jail cell. Holloway's composure slipped for just an instant, fury flashing in his eyes before the mask settled back into place. The desperate accusations of a cornered criminal, he said smoothly. I'm sure Judge Hammond recognizes them for what they are. But Hammond was studying Holloway thoughtfully. Perhaps, or perhaps not. I find Mrs. Blackwood's account remarkably consistent with the evidence, and Mr. Mercer's outburst, while not admissible testimony, is certainly provocative. He turned to the makeshift deputy who had been appointed in the sheriff's absence. Mr. Lewis, place Mr. Holloway under arrest pending investigation into conspiracy to commit murder. He can share accommodations with his associates until the circuit prosecutor arrives. The crowd murmured in shock. Holloway himself seemed frozen, disbelief written across his features as the deputy moved to take his arm. For a man who had operated above the law for so long, the sudden application of justice appeared incomprehensible. This is outrageous, he sputtered as the deputy secured his wrists. I am a respected businessman. You have no evidence. We have Mrs. Blackwood's testimony, Mr. Walker's testimony, and now Mr. Mercer's statement implicating you directly, Hammond interrupted. That's more than sufficient for an arrest. The prosecutor will determine if it's enough for an indictment. As Holloway was led away, still protesting his innocence, Eleanor felt a strange emptiness replace the tension that had driven her since learning of Jackson's disappearance. It wasn't triumph exactly. A man was dead by her hand. Others would face frontier justice, and Holloway's influence might yet protect him from the full consequences of his actions. But there was a sense of resolution, of order reasserting itself in a lawless place. You should rest, Jackson said quietly, touching her elbow. It's been a long day. Eleanor nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she truly was, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. Will you come by the Wilsons later? She asked. We need to discuss Providence, make plans for the next steps. A hint of a smile touched Jackson's lips. Providence, he repeated. Seems that name fits better than ever. He nodded. I'll come by at sunset. Get some sleep, Eleanor. You've earned it. As they parted ways, Eleanor reflected on how far she had come from the woman who had stepped off that stagecoach just days ago. She had arrived seeking marriage, stability, a conventional frontier life. Instead, she had found independence, danger, and a kind of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Thomas had been right about Providence, about the silver vein that ran deep through the mountain, about the future it could provide. But perhaps he had also been right about a different kind of Providence, the kind that brought people together across time and distance for purposes beyond their understanding. The kind that had led Eleanor Hayes from Boston's predictable confines to a Colorado mining claim, from the role of mail-order bride to that of mine owner and defender of her own destiny. The thought accompanied her as she made her way back to the Wilsons' store, where Martha waited with open arms and unasked questions. Whatever tomorrow might bring, the development of Providence, the legal proceedings against Holloway and his men, the continuation of her unlikely partnership with Jackson, Eleanor would face it with clear eyes and steady hands, just as Thomas had predicted, just as she had proved she could. The autumn air carried the first hint of winter as Eleanor stood at the entrance to Providence Mine, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. 3 months had passed since that fateful day in Judge Hammond's makeshift courtroom. 3 months of backbreaking work, small triumphs, and gradual transformation. The mine was beginning to yield its treasures more consistently now. the silver. Vein proving as rich as Thomas had claimed in his final letter. With Jackson's guidance, Eleanor had learned the rhythms of mountain life, the techniques of extracting ore, and the delicate balance of independence and community that frontier existence demanded. Silver Creek had changed too. Holloway's arrest had created a vacuum quickly filled by smaller claim owners, forming a cooperative mining association. Eleanor had been invited to join, an acknowledgement of Providence's growing importance and perhaps a tacit recognition of her own tenacity. The town felt different, as if a shadow had been lifted, allowing something new and hopeful to emerge. Early again, Jackson's voice came from behind her. She turned to find him leading 2 pack mules loaded with supplies. One day you might actually sleep past dawn. Eleanor smiled, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. Old habits. The mill in Boston opened at 6. I was required there by 5:30 to prepare the ledgers. She sipped the strong brew, savoring its warmth against the morning chill. Besides, I like watching the mountain wake up. Jackson nodded, understanding without need for further explanation. Over these months, they had developed a partnership, built on shared purpose and growing trust. He never questioned her capacity for the work, never suggested she return east to an easier life. Instead, he taught her, challenged her, expected her to rise to each new obstacle, and she had. The assayer's report came back, he said, unloading supplies from the mules. Last week's samples graded higher than expected, words spreading about Providence's yield. Eleanor absorbed this news, aware of its implications. Success brought attention, and attention brought complications. Already she'd received 3 offers to purchase her claim, all politely declined. We'll need to hire additional workers soon, she said. The secondary tunnel is ready for expansion. Tucker and his boy are looking for steady work, Jackson suggested. They're good miners, honest men. Could start next week if the terms suit. The easy way he said we and our didn't escape Eleanor's notice. Providence had become a shared endeavor, though the legal ownership remained solely hers. Jackson had never asked for a formal partnership arrangement, seemingly content with the fair wages she insisted on paying despite his initial protests. But she had been considering a more permanent arrangement, one that would secure his stake in what they were building together. I think that's an excellent idea, she agreed. And speaking of terms, I've been meaning to discuss something with you. She hesitated, suddenly uncertain despite their comfortable companionship. I've drawn up partnership papers for Providence, equal shares in the claim and its profits. I'd like you to consider them. Jackson went still, his hands pausing in their task of unsaddling the mules. For a moment he said nothing, his expression unreadable in the early morning light. Then he straightened, meeting her gaze directly. Why? He asked simply. It wasn't the response she'd expected. Eleanor took a breath, choosing her words carefully. Because it's right. Because this success belongs to both of us. Because I wouldn't be here without you, and Providence wouldn't be producing without your knowledge and work. You don't owe me anything, Eleanor, he said quietly. I've been paid fairly for my labor. This isn't about debt, she replied, frustration edging her voice. It's about recognition, partnership, future. She gestured toward the mine entrance. Providence was Thomas's vision, but its reality is ours. What we've built here deserves to be acknowledged formally. Jackson studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. You understand what this would mean? A formal partnership between us? His tone held a warning. People already talk. This would give them more reason. Eleanor knew exactly what he meant. The whispers had begun almost immediately after Holloway's arrest. Speculation about her relationship with Jackson, judgment thinly veiled as concern for propriety. Martha had gently suggested that living alone at the mine cabin invited misinterpretation. Eleanor had listened politely and changed nothing. Let them talk, she said now, lifting her chin slightly. I didn't come to Silver Creek to meet others' expectations. I came to build a life on my own terms. A slow smile spread across Jackson's face, transforming his normally serious features. Now that, he said, sounds like the Eleanor Blackwood who shot Wyatt Fleming to save a half-Ute guide she barely knew. The mention of that day still brought a shadow of regret, but no longer the sharp guilt that had initially plagued her. I'd prefer not to make a habit of shooting people, she replied dryly. So perhaps you could simply accept the partnership and save me the trouble of further demonstrations. Jackson's smile deepened. You make a compelling argument. He extended his hand, a formal gesture at odds with their familiar relationship. Partners, then? Eleanor took his hand, feeling calluses that matched her own, badges of shared labor and purpose. Partners, she agreed. The trial of Victor Holloway was set for the following week in Denver, with Eleanor and Jackson required to testify. The prospect of leaving Providence, even temporarily, filled Eleanor with unease. The mine had become more than property to her. It was home, sanctuary, the physical manifestation of her independence. But justice demanded their participation, and she would not shy away from completing what they had begun. They departed 2 days later, the journey to Denver filling 3 days of steady travel. The city itself was a shock after months in Silver Creek. The streets crowded with people, buildings rising 2 and 3 stories high, the constant noise and motion a stark contrast to the mountain's measured rhythms. Eleanor found herself almost overwhelmed, instinctively moving closer to Jackson as they navigated the bustling thoroughfares. It's smaller than Boston, she remarked, trying to master her unexpected discomfort. Why does it feel so much more intense? Jackson glanced at her with understanding. The mountains change your senses, he said, make you attentive to different things. The wind's direction, subtle sounds, open spaces, cities force everything. Closer together, it takes time to readjust. They found accommodation at a modest hotel near the courthouse, securing adjoining rooms that raised the clerk's eyebrows, but prompted no comment beyond a clipped, "Very good, sir, madam." Eleanor was grateful for Jackson's steady presence as they settled in to await the trial's commencement. The legal proceedings were both familiar and foreign to Eleanor. Judge Hammond was present, lending continuity to the process. But the Denver courtroom's formal atmosphere was far removed from the makeshift tribunal in Silver Creek's saloon. Holloway appeared diminished somehow, his once commanding presence reduced by 3 months in custody. Beside him, Mercer and Caleb Fleming sat sullenly, their expressions alternating between defiance and resignation. The prosecutor built his case methodically, presenting evidence of the conspiracy, calling witnesses from Silver Creek who testified to Holloway's history of intimidation, establishing the pattern that had culminated in Thomas's death and the attempt on Eleanor and Jackson. When Eleanor took the stand, she spoke clearly and directly, recounting the events without embellishment, describing what she had seen and heard in Devil's Gulch with precision born of vivid memory. Holloway's lawyer attempted to discredit her testimony, insinuating that her relationship with Jackson colored her account, questioning her motives in claiming Thomas's property. "Is it not true, Mrs. Blackwood," he asked with practiced skepticism, "that you never actually met Thomas Blackwood? That your supposed marriage was a convenient fiction?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I never claimed to have met Thomas in person," she replied. "Our relationship developed through correspondence over many months. We intended to marry upon my arrival. His death prevented that ceremony, but not the commitment that brought me to Colorado." "A commitment to the man," the lawyer suggested, "or to his silver mine?" "Both," Eleanor answered without hesitation. "Thomas offered partnership in every sense, life, work, purpose. I came to honor that offer. After his death, I chose to remain and build what we had planned together." And now, the lawyer continued, glancing meaningfully at Jackson. "You appear to have found a new partnership." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. "Providence Mine requires experienced management. Mr. Walker provides essential expertise. Our partnership is a matter of public record and legal documentation, unlike Mr. Holloway's arrangements with men like Silas Mercer." The lawyer abandoned that line of questioning shortly thereafter. Jackson's testimony proved even more damaging to the defense. His detailed account of the abduction and planned execution, corroborated by physical evidence and Mercer's own documented statements. By the trial's conclusion, the outcome seemed inevitable. The jury deliberated less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts for all 3 defendants. Holloway received 20 years for conspiracy to commit murder, Mercer 15, and Fleming 12, sentences that effectively ended their influence in Silver Creek forever. As they left the courthouse, Eleanor felt a curious lightness, as if a weight she'd carried for months had finally been set down. Justice had been served, not just for her and Jackson, but for Thomas as well. His death had not gone unanswered. "It's over," she said softly as they walked through Denver's busy streets. "Truly over." Jackson nodded, though his expression remained watchful, a habit born of years navigating a world that offered little safety to men of mixed heritage. "The legal part, yes," he agreed. "The rest continues." The rest? Building something worthwhile. At Providence, making Thomas's vision real. He glanced at her. "Living on our own terms, as you put it." Eleanor smiled, recognizing her own words returned to her. "Yes," she agreed. "That continues." They departed Denver the following morning, eager to return to familiar territory. The city had served its purpose. Justice had been done, but neither felt at home amid its ceaseless activity. The journey back to Silver Creek seemed faster somehow, as if the mountains were drawing them home with magnetic insistence. As they crested the final ridge overlooking the Providence claim, Eleanor reined in her horse, taking in the view that never failed to stir something profound within her. The cabin's chimney released a thin curl of smoke. Martha Wilson had arranged for Tucker's wife to tend the place in their absence, and the cleared area around the mine entrance showed signs of recent activity. But it was the mountains themselves that captured her attention, their ancient presence a reminder of how brief human concerns were in the greater span of time. "When I first arrived in Silver Creek," she said thoughtfully, "I thought I understood what I was seeking: security, purpose, a conventional life within unconventional surroundings." She shook her head slightly. "I had no idea." Jackson watched her, waiting for her to continue. "This place demands something different," she went on. "Not just adaptation, but transformation. It asks you to become someone new, someone stronger, more honest, more essential." She turned to him. "Does that make sense?" His smile was slow, but genuine. "Perfect sense," he said simply. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he added, "Thomas saw that potential in you, in his letters. I see it realized every day." The words touched something deep in Eleanor's heart, a recognition that transcended simple gratitude or affection. This man knew her, not the Boston bookkeeper she had been, nor some idealized version from Thomas's imagination, but the woman she had become in the crucible of Providence's challenges. "We should get back," she said finally, suddenly self-conscious. "There's work waiting." Jackson nodded, understanding the shift in her mood. "Always is," he agreed. As they rode down toward the cabin, Eleanor found herself thinking of Thomas's letter, of his belief that some things were meant to be, that paths crossed for a reason. She had come to Silver Creek following one such path, only to discover another waiting where the first had ended. Not a replacement, but a continuation, different in direction and character. but no less meaningful. Providence had turned out to be many things. A silver mine, yes, but also a principle, a journey, a transformation. It had given her not just independence and purpose, but a different understanding of connection, one forged through shared struggle and mutual respect, rather than conventional attachments. The future stretched before her, not with the certainty she had once craved, but with possibilities more varied and vital than she could have imagined stepping off that stagecoach months ago. Whatever came next, the expansion of the mine, the evolution of Silver Creek, the deepening of her partnership with Jackson, she would face it with the strength Providence had helped her discover within herself. And that, Eleanor reflected as they reached the cabin that had become home, was perhaps the richest silver vein of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.